She was 31 years old and had exactly $11 to her name when the sheriff's men set her belongings on the boardwalk outside the only home she had ever owned. Her late husband's brother, Colton Reeve, had forged a claim on the family land using a signature no magistrate in Comfort Springs, Texas, thought to question closely enough, and by the time she found a lawyer willing to listen, the papers were already filed and the matter, as far as the county was concerned, was closed. She took a room above a mercantile for 2 nights, paying in coins she counted twice each time, and on the third morning she walked past the burnt-out husk of the old Comfort Springs Trust building, shuttered since the war had swept through the county and never reopened, and there, half buried under fallen brick and a collapsed roof beam, stood the bank's old vault, a great iron door that had not turned on its hinge in over 20 years. She paid $3 for it, and for the ruined lot it sat on, to a county clerk who thought she'd lost her senses entirely. It seemed the last, most foolish act of a woman with nothing left to lose. But sealed inside that vault, untouched since the last man who closed it walked out to fight a war he never came home from, was something that would not only restore everything she had been robbed of, but would return to an entire town a piece of its own forgotten history. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Delphine Ashworth. If you have ever had something taken from you by someone who was supposed to protect you instead, tell us in the comments. We read every single one, and we are glad you are here with us tonight. Delphine Ashworth had not been born to hardship, though hardship had certainly found her by the time she reached 31. She came into the world in the spring of 1839 in the town of Comfort Springs, a modest settlement in the Texas Hill Country built around a clear-running spring that gave the place its name, a town of limestone buildings and live oaks and a slow, steady rhythm of ranching and small trade that had, for most of its history, been kinder to its residents than the rest of the frontier had any particular reason to be. Her father, Josiah Ashworth, had been the town's locksmith and, for a time in the years before the war, one of 2 men entrusted with the mechanism of the Comfort Springs Trust Vault itself, a position that carried with it not wealth but a particular kind of quiet respect, the respect owed to a man who held, quite literally, the key to his neighbor's security. Josiah was a careful man, deliberate in his movements and his speech, and he raised his daughter with an unusual education for a girl of that place and time, not merely in the domestic arts her mother taught her, though she learned those too, but in the mechanics of locks and hinges and the particular logic of things built to keep other things safe. He would sit her on his workbench as a girl of 7 or 8, letting her feel the tumblers of a practice lock give way beneath her small fingers, and he would tell her, with the patience of a man who genuinely loved his work, that a lock was not merely a barrier but a conversation, that every mechanism had a story it was trying to tell you if you were willing to listen closely enough to its clicks and its resistances. Her mother, Constance Ashworth, brought a different kind of steadiness to the household, a warmth that balanced her husband's precision, and it was from her mother that Delphine learned the particular southern art of keeping a household running through scarcity without ever letting the scarcity show in the food on the table or the welcome at the door. Constance had come from a family of modest means herself, and she had a horror of waste that bordered on philosophy. Nothing in the Ashworth household was ever thrown away while it still held use, and Delphine grew up watching her mother turn flour sacks into dresses and broken furniture into firewood and leftover Sunday dinners into a week of careful, nourishing meals. All of it done with a cheerfulness that made the thrift seem less like deprivation, and more like a kind of quiet competence. There is no such thing as nothing left, Constance used to tell her, kneading bread at the kitchen table while Delphine watched. There's only something you haven't found a use for yet. This was a double inheritance Delphine carried into her adult life, her father's patient understanding that locked things were only waiting to be understood, not feared, and her mother's unshakable conviction that value persisted even in what the world called ruin. She grew into a young woman known throughout Comfort Springs for a particular combination of gentleness and stubbornness that some found endearing and others found simply inconvenient, depending on which side of a disagreement with her they happened to find themselves. She was not a woman who raised her voice, but she was also not a woman who could be easily moved once she had settled her mind on a course, and this quality served her well when, at 23, she married Amos Reeve, a rancher's son from a family with considerably more land than the Ashworths had ever possessed, a marriage that surprised the town somewhat, given that Amos was known as an easygoing, almost dreamy young man, and Delphine is a woman of considerable practical sense, but which suited them both extremely well precisely because of that difference. Amos handled the cattle and the grazing leases with an intuitive feel for the land that his father had never quite managed to instill in his other son, Colton, and Delphine handled the household ledgers, the correspondence, the negotiations with buyers and suppliers, bringing to the marriage a business acumen that Amos was the first to admit exceeded his own. They had 11 years together on the Reeve land before the war took Amos, as it took so many men of that country, not in a dramatic cavalry charge but in a fever that swept through his cavalry unit's winter camp in 1863, a death that reached Delphine by letter months after it had already happened, so that she found herself grieving a husband who had, in some sense, already been gone from her life for a season before she even knew to grieve him. She was 30 years old, with no children, a sorrow she and Amos had carried quietly together for years, never speaking of it much, but feeling its absence in every empty room of the ranch house, and she found herself, in the aftermath of his death, the sole occupant of a piece of land that, under Texas law and the particular customs of that time and place, existed in a legal position more precarious than she had ever had cause to consider while her husband lived. It was into this precariousness that Colton Reeve stepped with a speed that Delphine, looking back, would come to understand had likely been planned for some time before Amos's death ever reached her ears. Colton had always resented his brother's ease with the land, and Delphine suspected, though she could never prove it, resented his brother's marriage as well, for Delphine's management of the ranch's business affairs had made the property considerably more profitable than it had been under their father's looser stewardship, and profitability, once established, becomes a thing men are loath to see pass into hands other than their own. Colton returned from his own more comfortable posting well behind the front lines within a year of his brother's death, and he began, with a patience Delphine had not credited him with possessing, to construct a legal case of the land's rightful inheritance passing to him rather than to his brother's widow, using a Texas legal tradition around land held in a deceased man's name and a signature on an old transfer document that Delphine was certain, though she could never prove this either, had been produced long after the date it claimed to bear. The county court, staffed in those chaotic post-war years by men more concerned with the mountain of legal business the conflict had left unresolved than with parsing the particular claims of a widow against her brother-in-law, ruled in Colton's favor within the space of a single unhurried afternoon, and Delphine found herself, at 31 years old, escorted from the only home she had known as a married woman by men who offered her, at least, the small courtesy of carrying her trunk to the boardwalk themselves rather than simply throwing it into the yard. She took a room above the Mercantile, run by a kind but overworked widow named Sarah Kepler who charged the lowest rate she could manage without drawing attention from her own creditors, and Delphine spent those first nights doing precisely what her mother had taught her to do in every crisis of her girlhood, counting what remained, honestly and without self-pity, to see what could still be built from it. What remained was $11, a modest collection of jewelry that had belonged to her mother and grandmother, a working knowledge of locks and mechanisms that had lain dormant since her girlhood, and a fierce, quiet determination not to leave Comfort Springs, the only home she had ever known, simply because the men who controlled its courts had decided she no longer belonged to it in the way she once had. It was on her third morning of this new and diminished life that she took a walk she had not taken in years, past the eastern edge of the town square where the old Comfort Springs Trust building had stood, shuttered and increasingly overgrown, since the early years of the war. The bank had failed in 1862, a casualty of the economic chaos the conflict had brought to Texas, its assets seized and distributed among creditors, its building left to the slow work of weather and neglect once the fire that gutted its upper floor in 1864 caused, town legend held, by a lightning strike, though no one had ever investigated closely enough to know for certain, made the structure unsafe for any ordinary use. The roof had partially collapsed. Brush had grown up thick around its foundation. But the vault itself, a great iron-doored chamber built into the rear of the structure by craftsmen brought in specially from San Antonio in the prosperous years before the war, stood largely intact beneath the rubble, its heavy door closed and, as far as anyone in Comfort Springs seemed to know or care, unopened since the bank's final days of operation. Delphine stood before it for a long while that morning, feeling something stir in her that she had not expected. Not merely the practical calculation of a woman assessing what might be salvaged, but something closer to recognition, the particular quiet thrill her father had once described to her as a feeling of standing before a lock that had not yet told you its story. She made her way to the county clerk's office, a cramped room in the newly rebuilt courthouse, and asked what it would take to purchase the ruined bank building and the lot it stood upon, both of which had reverted to county ownership in the settlement of the failed institution's affairs and had sat, unclaimed and untaxed because untaxable, as a minor administrative embarrassment ever since. The clerk, a young man named Franklin Voss who had only recently taken position and had no particular history with the Ashworth or Reeve families to color his judgment, looked at her with an expression that mixed genuine puzzlement with kind of reluctant admiration for her nerve. He told her frankly that the county would be glad to be rid of the liability, that the structure itself was worth nothing but the stone it was built from, and that $3 felt, to him, like rather more than the lot deserved, but was a minimum the county's own regulations permitted him to accept. Delphine paid the $3 from a dwindling 11 and walked away from that clerk's office holding a bill of sale for a ruined building that every soul in Comfort Springs who noticed a transaction at all considered proof that grief, or perhaps simple desperation, had finally gotten the better of her sense. She began clearing the site herself the following morning, before the day's heat set in, wearing an old work dress of her mother's and gloves she had found among what little she'd managed to keep, and it took her the better part of 2 weeks, working alone in the early hours and accepting occasional help from Sarah Kepler's grown son when he could spare an hour from the mercantile, to clear enough of the collapsed roof debris to reach the vault chamber itself. The great iron door, when she finally stood before it clean of rubble for the first time, was rusted at its hinges and bore. She noted with the same careful attention her father had taught her to bring to any mechanism. A lock of particular makes you recognize immediately. A herring-safe mechanism, one of the finest available before the war. The very type her father had once been trained to service and had, in fact, spoken of with something like reverence in the years before his own death, which had come quietly of age and illness some years before Delphine's marriage. The combination, of course, was lost to time, its knowledge having died, presumably, with whichever bank officer had last closed the door before the institution's collapse. But Delphine had spent countless childhood hours beside her father, learning not merely to turn combinations others gave her, but to listen to a lock's own internal logic, to feel for the subtle resistance points that indicated a tumbler falling into place. And she spent 3 full days at that vault door, patient as her father had ever been, turning the dial by fractions of an inch and listening with her ear pressed to the cold iron, until on the 3rd afternoon, in the slanting light of early evening, she felt the final tumbler give way beneath her fingers with a soft, definitive click, and the great door, groaning against hinges that had not moved in over 20 years, swung open into darkness. The vault's interior was cool and remarkably dry, sealed so effectively against the elements that the dust within lay undisturbed in a thin, even layer across every surface, and in the fading light from the doorway, Delphine could make out shapes that resolved, as her eyes adjusted, into the ordinary remnants of a bank's daily business. Ledger books stacked on shelving along one wall, a small iron strong box in the corner, several deed boxes bearing the names of families she recognized from her girlhood. But it was the ledger books themselves, when she began, over the following days, to carry them out into the light and examine them one by one, that revealed something far larger than she had anticipated finding in that quiet, sealed chamber. The Comfort Springs Trust, she learned from the careful entries of its final cashier, a man named Reuben Falk, whose neat handwriting filled page after page in the months before the bank's collapse, had not failed in the ordinary way that banks failed during the economic chaos of the war, through bad loans or simple insolvency. It had failed because its majority owner, a man named Bartholomew Creed, who had also served, in those years, as the president of the county's land office, had systematically diverted depositor funds into his own private accounts in the months before the institution's collapse, using his dual position to falsify records in both the bank's books and the county's land filings simultaneously, covering his theft from depositors by quietly altering property records to suggest debts and liens that did not, in truth, exist, effectively transferring the equity of a dozen or more Comfort Springs families into obligations that flowed through a chain of shell transactions back to accounts under Creed's control. Reuben Falk had discovered this scheme in the bank's final weeks, and rather than expose it publicly, given the chaos already engulfing the region as war fever swept through Texas, and given his own reasonable fear of what a man as well-connected as Creed might do to silence an accusing cashier, he had instead spent his last days at the institution quietly gathering evidence, sealing the true, uncorrupted original ledgers and land documents inside the vault itself, along with a detailed letter, explaining what he had found, before enlisting in the Texas Regiment himself and dying, as Delphine would later confirm through county records, at a skirmish near Galveston before the war's end, taking with him into death the only living knowledge of exactly what those sealed vault records contained. Delphine sat with Reuben Falk's letter in the fading light of that first week, reading his careful, urgent handwriting by the glow of a lamp she had carried in from a rented room, and she understood, with a clarity that left her hands trembling slightly against the brittle pages, that she was holding evidence of a fraud that had reshaped the fortunes of an entire town, a fraud whose architect, Bartholomew Creed, had used his stolen wealth and his manipulated land records to build, in the years since, one of the largest and most respected ranching operations in the county, an operation that had, she realized with a slow, cold recognition, absorbed several parcels of land originally belonging to families whose names she recognized from her own girlhood, families who had simply been told, at various points over the preceding decade, that old debts or liens required them to sell, families who had no reason to doubt records that bore the county's own official stamp. The deed boxes in the vault, she discovered as she worked through them methodically over the following 2 weeks, contained the original, uncorrupted versions of these very land records, proof dated and witnessed before Creed's alterations, that the debts used to pressure these families off their land had never existed at all, that the transfers had been built on fabrication from their very foundation. And woven through it all was a smaller, more painful thread that Delphine had not expected to find. Among the falsified transactions was a very transfer document Colton Reeve had used to claim the Ashworth Reeve Ranch from her, a document that bore, she now understood upon comparing it carefully against genuine examples of her late father-in-law's signature preserved in the vault's older records, unmistakable signs of the same kind of careful forgery Creed had perfected. For Colton Reeve, it turned out, had been a junior clerk in Bartholomew Creed's land office in the years just after the war, and had learned, evidently, considerably more from his employer than honest record-keeping. Delphine did not act rashly upon this discovery, though the temptation, she would later admit, burned in her fiercely for several days. Bartholomew Creed remained, in that year of 1870, among the most powerful men in Comfort Springs, his ranching operation employing dozens, his influence extending into the county court itself through relationships built over years of careful cultivation, and Colton Reeve, whatever debt he owed to his old mentor's methods, now sat comfortably on land that had been Delphine's home for 11 years. She understood, with the same careful patience her father had taught her to bring to any lock that had not yet yielded its secrets, that evidence alone, however damning, would not be enough to move a county court disinclined to challenge its most prominent citizen without overwhelming, undeniable proof and, more importantly, without allies willing to stand beside her when the challenge came. She began, over the following month, a quiet campaign of her own, working through the deed boxes to identify every family whose land had passed through Creed's manipulated transactions, and calling upon them one by one, not with accusations but with the simple, careful presentation of the original documents she had found, documents that spoke for themselves in a way no assertion of Hayes could have matched. She found the Delacroix family, whose modest spread had been folded into Creed's holdings under the pretext of a debt that the original vault records proved had been satisfied years before it was ever invoked. She found the widow Ostrander, whose small property near the spring itself had been the first parcel Creed scheme had claimed, back when the fraud was still new and untested. One by one, quietly, without fanfare, Delphine built not merely a legal case but a coalition, a growing circle of Comfort Springs families who understood, as she laid the original record before them, that they had all been victims of the same patient, methodical theft, disguised for years as simple bad luck or unfortunate debt. Bartholomew Creed, when word of Delphine's activities finally reached him, as it inevitably did in a town the size of Comfort Springs, did not respond with a direct confrontation she might have expected from a lesser man. He was, whatever his moral failings, a shrewd operator, and he moved instead through the county court itself, filing a petition arguing that Delphine's purchase of the old bank lot conveyed no legitimate right to documents found within it, that the records of a failed institution belonged, by law, to the county or to whatever creditor's body had originally claimed the bank's assets, and that her circulation of these documents among Comfort Springs families constituted, in his lawyer's careful phrasing, an irresponsible and potentially slanderous disruption of settled property arrangements that the community had long since accepted. Colton Reeve, for his part, took a more direct approach, appearing at Sarah Kepler's Mercantile one evening to inform Delphine, with a coldness she had not previously seen from him, that continuing to pursue the matter of the ranch would result in consequences she would regret, though he was careful, even in his threat, never to specify precisely what those consequences might be. Delphine did not retreat from either pressure. She had learned, In the 11 days it had taken to lose Amos, and in the years of careful ledger-keeping that followed, that fear given too much room simply grew to fill whatever space was allotted it. And she had, in any case, very little left that either man could take from her that had not already been taken. She sought out Judge Elias Thorncrest, the circuit judge who oversaw the county's more significant civil matters and who had, unlike the local court that had originally ruled against her, no particular history of deference to Bartholomew Creed's interests, having only recently been assigned to the circuit from a neighboring county. She laid the entire matter before him. Reuben Falk's letter, the original uncorrupted ledgers, the comparison of signatures that proved a forgery patent connecting Creed's land office fraud to the document Colton Reeve had used against her, and the testimony, which he had by then gathered in careful written form, of a dozen Comfort Springs families willing to swear to the circumstances under which they had lost their own land. The hearing that followed, held in the rebuilt county courthouse over the course of 3 long days at autumn, drew a crowd larger than Comfort Springs had seen for any civil matter in living memory, for by then the story of what Delphine Ashworth had found sealed inside that old bank vault had traveled through every household in the county, and there was scarcely a family who did not know someone touched, in some fashion, by Bartholomew Creed's decade of quiet theft. Creed's lawyers argued, as expected, that the vault's contents were the property of the defunct institution's creditors and irrelevant to current land titles regardless of their content, but Judge Thorncrest, examining the original documents alongside the county's own corrupted records with the same patient attention Delphine had brought to the vault's lock itself, found the pattern of forgery too consistent, too methodically documented across a dozen separate transactions, to dismiss as coincidence or as the ravings of a bitter widow. Reuben Falk's letter, read aloud in its entirety before the packed courtroom, moved even hardened observers to a stunned and uncomfortable silence, for it was, in its way, the testimony of a dead man reaching across 7 years to finally tell the truth he had not lived long enough to speak himself. The judge's ruling, delivered on the 3rd day, restored to Delphine and to every other affected family in Comfort Springs a land that had been fraudulently taken from them, voiding the corrupted transactions on the strength of the original vault documents and ordering a full county review of every property transaction that had passed through Bartholomew Creed's land office during his tenure there. Creed himself, facing not only the loss of the vast majority of his ranching empire, but formal criminal referral for fraud that would occupy the county's attention for years afterward, so his standing in Comfort Springs collapsed within the space of that single autumn, his once considerable influence evaporating as swiftly as it had been built on foundations that could not withstand honest daylight. Colton Reeve, whose forgery was laid bare alongside his mentor's larger scheme, relinquished his claim to the Ashworth-Reeve land without further contest, understanding, perhaps for the first time, the full weight of what continued resistance might cost him, and left Comfort Springs County entirely within the year, his departure marked by no ceremony and very little regret among those he left behind. Delphine did not simply reclaim her ranch and retreat into the private comfort she had more than earned through those difficult months. Understanding, with a mother's old instinct for finding use in what others called ruin, that the vault itself and the old bank building above it still held value beyond the documents she had already recovered, she used a portion of the restored ranch's income over the following years to rebuild the structure, not as a private bank this time, but as a Comfort Springs Trust and Ledger office, a modest institution she established and ran herself, drawing on the very skills her father had given. Offering fair record-keeping and honest small credit to the families of the county in a manner that made a particular kind of fraud Bartholomew Creed had practiced considerably harder to repeat. The old vault door itself, repaired and oiled until it swung as smoothly as it must have in its finest years, became something of a local landmark, and Delphine, in the decades that followed, became known throughout the county not merely as a woman who had reclaimed her own land, but as a steady hand behind the honest recording of half the county's most important transactions. And so we return to where this story began, to a woman of 31 standing before a ruined vault that every soul in Comfort Spring considered the final proof of her diminished circumstances, a woman with $11 dwindling toward nothing in a home that had been taken from her by the very family she had trusted. Delphine Ashworth could not have known, paying her $3 to a puzzled county clerk, that the smallness of that purchase, a ruined building, a rusted door, a lock no one else believed worth the trouble of opening, was about to become the instrument not merely of her own restoration but of an entire county's reckoning with a theft it had never known to grieve. She did not find what she found because fortune favored her. She found it because her father had taught her that every lock holds a conversation for those patient enough to listen, and because her mother had taught her that nothing is ever truly nothing, that value persists quietly in what the world discards, waiting only for someone willing to look closely enough and to turn the dial one more careful fraction of an inch to bring it back into the light. Thank you for sitting with us through Delphine's story tonight. If something in it stirred you, we would be grateful if you pass it along to someone who might need a reminder that what looks like ruin sometimes holds a truth that sets everything right again. We would love to know, in the comments below, what is a time you found real value in something the world around you had already written off. We read every story you share with us, and we carry them with us long after. Until next time, stay close.